Today is Sunday, November 28th, and there are presidential and municipal elections in Honduras. This is the first presidential election since 2017, when it was highly contested and expected that fraud was committed in order for the long-standing president, Juan Hernandez, to remain in power against a left-wing and really a kind of a popular coalition that included right-wing parties as well, all the opposition to who has become the dictator and central political figure in Honduras in the last decade, Hernandez, who ended up benefiting from the United States-backed coup d'etat in 2009. And I wanted today talk a little bit about the elections, the context that is going on there, and the way that Hernandez's reign is finally coming to an end, although his successor is one of the main candidates in the elections today. There's not much expectation that he would win without fraud, and yet there have been massive numbers of assassinations of candidates, and this is basically one of the least safe and democratic processes in the world right now. So there's really no guarantee. And that Hernandez, I want to look in particular at an article that was published in the last week in the New Yorker, where the journalist interviews really all the main figures in Honduras and in the U.S. that were involved there in the last decade. So this article is much more in-depth and comprehensive than anything that I've seen published in English on Honduras in the last decade, which is really saying something. It's hardly without fault, but I think it's significant nonetheless, and signals some sort of sea change underway. The fact that Hernandez's brother is on trial for being one of the world's largest narco traffickers in the U.S. right now, and the kind of stain that this puts on American policy really across the region. And so you see some pivoting and attempting to finesse the narrative going on right now, which I think we could also kind of categorize is in the context of Secretary of State Blinken's attempts to kind of redo the cosmetics of U.S. foreign policy. So my basic assumption about this article is that the main let me say that this was published on November 15th, and that the journalist's name is John Lee Anderson. The article in the print edition goes by the title False Friends, and its online version, which I think is available to anyone, has the title, Is the President of Honduras a Narco Trafficker? And it seems like Hernandez is being hung out to dry, but one can come to the conclusion that the U.S. is attempting a pivot to look for a new ally, some kind of new set of alliances or regime in Honduras that will continue the bottom line of policy there. And to really understand that, we have to go back to the 80s and kind of take a long look at what are the U.S.'s so-called interests in the region. At least what are the supposed interests that have been defended and have kind of acted as the natural law through which one can't not trespass and the coup in 2009 is kind of the um, most recent example of why was President Zelaya deposed, and what was at stake in his presidency. In office less than 4 years, and yet the United States backed his removal by the military without any democratic pretense, and they also backed the ensuing regimes and have been spending um, massive amounts of money supporting the Honduran regime since then. And one has to zoom out and grasp this picture in which the most dangerous country, the highest murder rate in the region, um, the epicenter of the immigration crisis, which is constantly in the headlines in the U.S., um, people fleeing, not really for any, um, whatever the kind of right-wing talking points are about immigration. It's undeniable that massive numbers of people flee Honduras for their lives, for the lack of security, that this has been a narco state without the rule of law for the last decade, and yet the utter silence and kind of prevailing ignorance over this situation, in which the other major country on which Honduras shares a border, Nicaragua, which is not an epicenter of immigration to the U.S., which is not a dangerous place with any comparison to Honduras, and yet what are the policies towards these two countries? Honduras, the recipient of massive amounts of military assistance and financial aid. Nicaragua, now facing the same types of sanctions and pressures that Cuba and Venezuela have been under, which amount in many ways to forms of warfare. And when we look at the amount of people that have left Venezuela since the economic crash in 2018, this is the type of devastation that resembles, in some ways, the effects of war. When an economy can basically be embargoed and crippled, have their assets seized overseas, as has happened to Venezuela. These are not incidental types of measures that the U.S. is able to exercise against another country. So I think that, just to repeat, that comparison, it totally scrambles the narrative that prevails in the U.S. and should really be, it's a cliche to say front page news, but it should scramble the discourse, and it should cause a kind of collective rethinking of geopolitics, and really, at least, what is going on with U.S. foreign policy. That for decades you have these just inhuman and punitive policies against people in Central America, and the just straight up lies speaking out of two different mouths, talking about human rights and democracy and a war on drugs, when it's the opposite of all of those. Okay, so let's talk about the elections today and the undemocratic efforts of the U.S. in Honduras in recent times. There have been at least in the 30s of candidates assassinated leading up to this election, and I would draw attention, for example, to the case right now of Cristian Alberto Villanueva, who is a mayoral candidate for the Libre Party in the department of Colón. And the Libre Party is a really interesting coalition of activist grassroots groups in some of, this is a very rural part of Honduras, and there's something, I think, kind of marvelous about the ability of resistance and grassroots organizing that has prevailed and in some ways flourished perversely under this kind of narco dictatorship. They most likely won to the extent that had there been a fair or legal count of the vote in 2017, the presidential election with this kind of populist radio host, Nasrallah, as the candidate. He's currently the vice presidential candidate in 2021 today for the former First Lady, the wife of Manuel Zelaya. And so Xiomara Castro. So there has been, in some ways, this kind of persisting threat, if you will, of the return of Zelaya and their ability to link up with other sectors of Honduran civil society that want change. And in the case of Villanueva and Santa Fe and Colon, this is a community response to hydroelectric projects, to the selling of their land, in which these financial interests, privatizing the land, tormenting the people, kicking them off, and in hand with the kind of paralegal apparatus in which the sicarios and the hitmen for the narcos act as the de facto power in the region. So these are the sorts of balances of forces that are seen around the country in which people are continuing to mount electoral campaigns, even in the threat of really unprecedented violence. So this, I think, in my experience, this sort of coalition of the Libre Party is somewhat unique. That on one hand, they're able to accomplish these coalitions at the national level, presidential candidates with widespread recognition, and a kind of partnering of the Zelaya, Castro, left-wing party, formerly of the Liberal Party, from the decade of the 2000s. There was a split. Zelaya tilted left once he was in power, prior to his removal in 2009. And then now this alliance with Castro and Nasrallah, who represents really different sectors of popular society, but then also kind of, that horizontal, but also this kind of vertical integration of reaching into the countryside and these grassroots organizations that certainly don't have all of the same interests by any means, but that there's a kind of willingness to make coalition and to unite against the kind of the level of corruption and violence that's been prevailing. And so we'll see what happens today. There's been a lot of violence and intimidation. There's also been some good reporting. Radio Progreso is a Facebook page that I'm looking at right now. They have reporters at the polls in many of the different territories. And so obviously there's a lot of challenges that go with holding a vote like this. What different forms of intimidation, whether it's assassination of candidates, intimidation at the polls themselves, fear of reprisals from now this, I might be sort of assuming this without saying it, but the assassinations have been candidates from the opposition. That is the Libre Party and the Liberal Party. And the ruling National Party of Juan Orlando Hernandez, I'm going to talk about him a little bit more momentarily, is widely understood as in lockstep with the narcos. I mean, really, there is no separation. This is understood by everyone. And so, if you're in a small town in which there really is no, you know, security force other than this kind of paralegal partnership, voting can be just even casting a vote can be a kind of act of bravery, and also something that one can fear reprisals. In the mayoral race in the Central District, the National Party candidate David Chavez Madison is being denounced at the moment for inciting violence, and for promoting this sort of air of intimidation. So let's get in then to what is notable about this New Yorker article, and what it says about Hernandez, the ruling National Party, and the kind of long, wide-angle view of history in Honduras. The article seems to tap dance around some unavoidable facts for anyone who kind of can look in and have the kind of long memory that these liberal U.S. outlets like the New Yorker, the Washington Post, is sort of their specialty in omitting and somehow innocently presuming that the United States has the best interests of all involved at all times, and in being so presumptuous, that this journalist somehow also is able to interview all the principals, from Hernandez himself to the new National Party candidate Nasri Tito Asfuera, Papi a la Orden. The journalist does not conspicuously gives very little attention, or does not interview or quote Xiomara Castro, Mel Zelaya, or their ally Salvador Nasrallah. It's alluded to that there were questions about he says that the election of 2017, there are allegations of its fraud, but he's even kind of light on how clearly the reporting was cut, the count was changed, and against everyone's understanding of how the vote had actually gone. Juan Orlando Hernandez basically, with control over the courts and the legal apparatus, self-selected himself in 2017, and the hypocrisy of his reign, which was to exceed the single-term limit on a presidency, which was the initial kind of wedge that was lodged against Mel Zelaya in 2009, which I think really plays on some of the weakness of left discourse in the U.S. and its radiation out into the way that leftist strategy and ideology is framed everywhere. This idea of the caudillo and the kind of taking as a natural law the United States form of electioneering, that term limits and anyone who exceeds term limits, that's a breach of democracy. Yet the sort of power sharing, the two-party system in the U.S., which denies any third-party candidates the opportunity, in which money reigns supreme. One has to have hundreds of millions of dollars to have any shot. That's still somehow our natural assumption of what democracy is, and yet in places like, for example, Nicaragua and Venezuela, we see the ability to win this kind of rhetorical war internationally by pointing at the fact that they have perennial presidency, and that the idea that that in itself um, is evidence enough that there's a lack of democracy, um, which without kind of thinking about you know that is there, for example, um, is there something democratic in those two countries, in the interests of um, the 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 revolutionary or left-wing party, um, for example, their resistance to privatization, their opposition to the former oligarchies that saw the resources of the country drained into the pockets of American businesses, I should say U.S. businesses. So um, there's really sort of a contest underfoot of how we even conceive of what is democratic, um, and this article by Anderson really doesn't come close to challenging some of that. But what it does do, interestingly, is it is one of the few places I've seen any discussion by the United States operatives involved in the 2009 coup. And this has often been laid at the feet of Hillary Clinton, who was Obama's Secretary of State at the time. And so Obama and Clinton have never had to answer for the coup or the long kind of the long list of deleterious effects that it has taken on. They've been able to manage that quite easily. Hillary Clinton is probably more identified with the coup and has really brushed off that they did anything wrong. And so I'll read here a little bit, going in depth of this now. This is going to reference not just Clinton, but the local diplomat who was even more hands-on in what happened in 2009. Referring to the 1980s and the war against Nicaragua and the Sandinistas at that time, in which Honduras became basically an extended United States military base, and didn't have a civil war where there were left-wing and peasant insurgencies in the rest of Central America, because there was simply a military dictatorship and was operating as the United States base in order to invade and wage war on Nicaragua. Anderson writes, by viciously repressing the left, Honduras escaped the civil wars that devastated its neighbors, but it also never experienced the reconciliation that followed. And he's referring here to some of the truth and human rights commissions that were set up in the 90s and 2000s in places like Guatemala, which allowed in some ways for kind of collective thought and attention to the at times even genocidal practices, and sort of when he says that Honduras was denied that sort of reconciliation, I think he's suggesting that there's perhaps something collectively cathartic, perhaps difficult to concretely point at and say what the results of that would be, but airing of truth, being able to have even traumatic history named at and recognized. He goes on, Dan Restrepo, who served as National Security Advisor for Latin America during Obama's first term, told me, quote, the peace process at least helped metabolize the ideological conflicts that had led to the civil wars. But in Honduras, it was as if the page had never been turned. This is the sort of pivot that we see here. Restrepo is personally involved in the coup that overthrows Zelaya, and yet in this article, he's sort of coming out of the shadows. He's rarely discussed his role or done these kind of media appearances. And here he seems to be sort of lamenting what he was involved with, and suggesting that these were issues that really weren't U.S. issues at all, but are somehow endemic to the region, kind of almost like the failed state narrative. So he says that, he refers to the ideological conflicts that had led to the civil wars. This is basically just a falsification of history. The Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua was not an ideological conflict that led to a civil war. It was the continuation of a long period, a long history that really is endemic to the Americas of independence, decolonization. The Sandinistas refer to Augusto Cesar Sandino, the revolutionary who in the 1920s was rising up against the United States banana republic policies in Nicaragua, wanting to lead the territory of Nicaragua as an independent nation. It's that simple, and these were not Marxist parties in the sense that the kind of Cold War rhetoric paints it so much as anti-colonial. And so the fact that the U.S. committed terrorism against the Sandinistas, mining the harbor, using torture, using death squads, and all the kind of effects of the dirty war. It's very simplistic and really inaccurate to describe this as an ideological conflict leading to the Civil War. But we see that again and again in these days in the kind of revisionary history of the Cold War, that the United States, despite any incidental errors, should be taken at its word that it meant to contain Soviet influence in the world. It's bullshit. And so he goes on. He talks about the fact that during the Contra War, Honduras became a central node in the cocaine traffic from Colombia into the U.S. And I think that is an important part of the narrative, that the Contras, the counter-revolutionaries, the death squads that were being trained at Fort Benning, Georgia in the U.S., were working in concert and really metastasized, I think, became so interlinked with narco-trafficking that they become inseparable at a certain point. They become a kind of de facto paralegal military order with a massive amount of connection to international finance. And what's fascinating and difficult to sort of disentangle there is the way in which the CIA and the DEA and the U.S. legal apparatus always is able to benefit from the mafia world, the illegal world. There's something about having the rule of law on your side that makes those on the other side of the law pliable to your will. And perhaps the most notorious example of this is the Kennedy assassination, the anti-Castro Cuban terrorists involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion and afterwards, and the way that the mafia is sort of deep in the perfect words of the great poet Allen Ginsberg, the CIA and mafia are in cahoots, had to be playing on the jukebox. So this kind of this dark alliance, as Gary Webb called it, between narco-trafficking and the counter-revolutionary ongoing practices of the U.S. across the region. That is the bottom line. That's the policy or the natural law, we could say, being imposed by the U.S., whether it's under Juan Orlando Hernandez currently, or whatever they're scheming to have come next. This is the long history of the region, and I would like to spend some time, hopefully in future episodes of these recordings, investigating that kind of complex further. How is that such a propitious strategy for for organizations like the CIA to partner with those that they hold this uh, this kind of legal supremacy over. If one it's like a sicario is the policeman's best friend, they're able to um, uh, they're able to basically blackmail them with punishment under the law, or on the other hand, it's the ultimate get out of jail free card. Um, and so Anderson goes on. He describes the sort of way in which that that narco operation in the 1980s led in essentially to the current network of narco trafficking that really prevails at the level of the presidency now with Juan Orlando Hernandez and his brother, but surely is not limited just to those characters. Anderson is talking about a partner of Pablo Escobar from the 1980s who owned the airplane fleet used for trafficking. His name is Juan Ramon Mata Ballesteros, who's currently in U.S. federal prison. And so I want to come back to Restrepo, who several paragraphs later, this is the Obama department advisor who was involved in the coup. Anderson brings him back into the story a little bit later on. He says, "New elections were held a few months later, and the winner was Porfirio Lobo Sosa from the Conservative National Party." So this is after Anderson has sort of danced around the 2009 coup against Zelaya, really not mentioning Restrepo at all in that retelling of it, and essentially suggesting that Zelaya got what was coming to him by striking friendship with Hugo Chavez and Raul Castro. He goes on, as the U.S. government determined its position on the coup, Restrepo visited officials in the new government. Quote, "It was like getting in a time machine," quote, he said. "They were all old-school Latin American Cold Warriors. They saw Chavez behind every tree and had an apparent deep distrust of the broader population." Restrepo found Lobo, quote, "an underwhelming guy, very much an empty suit. But," he said, "there was no really good way for us to reinstate Zelaya, so it became a matter of them running out the clock. Secretary of State Clinton accepted the elections, and the coup seemed impossible to reverse." So this is the kind of nuancing and reframing of the narrative. They go from defending the coup, from being those who recognize the new government, who masterminded the disposal of their political enemies in the area, and who have deep ties to the illegal golpistas, the committers of the coup, and the narco influences that this brought in, and they sort of reclassify themselves as shocked at what happened, and that it was not them who were the Cold Warriors, but somehow it's the golpistas themselves who were paranoid about Hugo Chavez, and that the U.S., wishing to reinstate Zelaya, wishing for some sort of democratic resolution, just couldn't pull it off. And the record just doesn't bear that out. But it's become so embarrassing and unavoidable that Hernandez is himself a major narco trafficker, that the U.S. is caught in its own lie and is being forced to re-narrate. um, so did Restrepo make any statements at the time that he had these reservations? After visiting the new government, they vilified Zelaya. He says here there was no really good way for us to reinstate Zelaya. Again, the record doesn't bear this out. And again, something that is totally missing in this article and in the general prevailing narrative. What are they saying at the moment? This article from the liberal outlet, the New Yorker, has no sympathy for, is totally ignorant of the social movements that have been resisting the Hernandez regime. They show a few pictures of anti-Ho graffiti in the capital, Tegucigalpa, that say Ho narco, and that's their evidence that there's disaffection with the government. It totally ignores the Libre Party. It ignores the assassinations. It makes some reference to it, but the kind of real people whose lives have been threatened, whose lives have been lost, and who have continued to build coalitions and mount campaigns. And so there's this strange antipathy to the coalition that is the favorite to replace the National Party today of Xiomara Castro. He actually has the gall to say that all the current options, he says, the nominees for the country's two major parties have their own links to previous administrations. It's not quite how it comes out, but the suggestion is that Hondurans have no options, that there is no opposition, that the past is muddled, and that Zelaya is part of that muddled past, and so the opposition party is nothing for anyone to be excited about, but is really just a continuation of the order of things, and perhaps that's one point that should be considered and debated, but I think it also ought to be framed that people are giving up their lives for a very uncertain likelihood that some kind of free election could be held, and that this regime could be ousted and some sort of rule of law could return. I mean, that I know from my friends there, that is a demand that's felt really at every level of society, the rule of law, that people can't just be assassinated on the street for tit for tat conflicts, for petty theft, for just pure intimidation, and so you can imagine the motivation of hope for a popular movement to come to power, and the down to the development and the selling of land and privatization that's going on, that some sort of legal democratic process could be in place where construction and development could be done, but not under just pure corrupt, where all the profit is going to go into the pockets of the people who are terrorizing the community, but that could be used for some general interests. Maybe we'd say that drug trafficking itself isn't inherently something that that in my opinion just totally swallows this absurd U.S. Fed narrative that we're on the side against drug trafficking, which has proven to be false, but also the consumption of drugs is. I think it really has something to do about this matrix of the necessity of an illegal economy. It's really big money, but it also was used very cynically to fund this counter-revolutionary war. And so rather than the U.S. mounting a war on drugs. I think I would describe it as it's been administering the narco state in this area, because that is the strategy through which the popular movements are repressed and are kept in this kind of permanent state um, of poverty. Now, whether the Democrat and Republican parties themselves have some interest in the immigration crises, the article by Anderson alludes to this sort of strange fact that American political campaigns can be won and lost based on these so-called immigration crises. Um, that's that's a kind of idea there that I don't know what to make of that. I'd rather look at it through the perspective of the people themselves, at least, that are fleeing, and what are their rights? What are the sort of horizons of I think one thing we could take from that is the obviousness that American power and presidential politics affect the whole world, and that the scapegoating of immigrants and the denial of rights there is really part of the whole, um, structure of the system. The entire sub-layers of agricultural um, labor in the U.S. Being based on illegal immigration and the necessity of this labor force that doesn't have basic rights and doesn't have voting rights, despite the kind of scaremongering about immigrants voting. The opposite is true. Immigrants, not only should they vote, but social movements as well should kind of recognize the value of their experiences, the potential leadership. This goes back to some of the wisdom of the German social movements at the time of the Syrian crisis, of turning the liberal kind of pitying slogan "Flüchtlinge willkommen" on its head. Refugees welcome. Let's make Berlin a Syrian city. These people shouldn't be pitied, but should be sort of celebrated for their experiences of surviving war and the kind of radical perspectives, socialist perspectives, we might say, that can emerge from those experiences. And so, just to kind of wrap up here with the Anderson article and the video here, again, there's kind of this silence and ignorance around the elections that are underfoot, around the social movements that are pushing for change currently, and there's a lot of silence and evasion around the underlying narrative that any examination of the facts dictates about what the U.S. Bottom line has been in the region for all this time. So I think that is going to be a wrap. There aren't any results yet. It's kind of midday on Sunday. I think the polls will be open for most of the day, and I will try to put some links in the video below. And with that, thanks a lot for listening.